Quick video here going over our Quizizz and showing you on the quadrilateral flowchart, which I have over here, where to find answers at and stuff like that. I've zoomed in on just the section with parallelograms, rectangles, rhombus, and square, just because that's the only things we're going to be talking about with this Quizizz. And I know you probably can't read that really well, but I know that you have this as well. I've shared it to you. You can bring it up on your own computer, but I'm trying to show you how to use this flow chart with answering the questions. All right, so the first question says, which of the following will always have four congruent sides? Well, if I look over here, nothing under parallelogram says it has four congruent sides. Nothing with rectangles does. But if I look over at rhombus, it says all sides are congruent, okay? Which obviously all sides is four sides. There's four sides in quadrilaterals. Well, if the rhombus has all sides congruent, then the square definitely does too, because the square is a special type of rhombus. That's why it's below rhombus. I have a parallelogram here. Rhombus and rectangle are each types of parallelograms, and square is a special type of rhombus and rectangle. It's both of them, actually. So whatever I have in a rhombus is also the same for a square. So if I have four congruent sides in a rhombus, then I will also for a square. That's how you read this. So if I show my answers here, that would be the two it would be. It would be square and rhombus has four congruent sides. Go on to the next one. Which of the following will always have four congruent angles? Kind of the same deal. The first time I see four congruent angles is with a rectangle. They're all right angles. So if a rectangle has four congruent angles, then so will a square, because the square comes below it in the flow chart. So square is an actual type of rectangle, so it will also have four congruent angles. So square and rectangle would be your answers. True or false, a square is a rectangle? Yes, square is below rectangle in the progression. So square is a special type of rectangle. It is true. It says rectangle is a square. No, a rectangle can be a square, but it doesn't mean it is a square. Rectangle is above the square in the flow chart. So since the rectangle is up here, the square is down there. No, the rectangle is not always going to be a square. Sometimes it will be a square, but no, it has to have all four sides also to be that are congruent to also be a square. So that is false. A rhombus is a parallelogram. Yeah, rhombus is a type of parallelogram. Rhombus is here, parallelogram's up above it. So rhombus falls under the parallelogram category. And it should have said false there. The answer's true, but it should have said true, false, obviously. I don't know what face is, but whatever. So it's true. Yeah, rhombus is a type of parallelogram. A square is not a parallelogram. That's false. Square is down here. Everything below parallelogram is a parallelogram. So that is false. Trapezoid is a parallelogram. There is no trapezoid under parallelogram. If I scroll over, can't really get over there right now. But anyway, you should know trapezoid's all the way over by itself. It's its own little category for quadrilaterals. It is not a parallelogram. So it is false. A square is a rhombus, but not a rectangle. Square is below rectangle and rhombus. You see how they have little lines coming off and they do an arrow together? So that's false. It's both. Square is both a rhombus and a rectangle. The opposite sides of a rhombus are congruent. Well, that's going to be true because all sides are congruent. So if all sides of a rhombus are congruent, then opposite sides would be congruent as well. Even more so, opposite sides of parallelograms are always congruent, and a rhombus is a type of parallelogram. So yeah, opposite sides of rhombus will be congruent. Select the statement, always, sometimes, or never true. The diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. Well, if you look, diagonals are congruent. It tells you right there, diagonals of a rectangle are congruent. That is always true. True or false, the diagonals of a rhombus bisect each other. Well, what's it say? Diagonals bisect the opposite angles. Okay, it doesn't tell you right here, but if I look up here under parallelogram, diagonals bisect each other. So since all parallelograms have diagonals that bisect each other, then everything down here has, everything below parallelogram, all the special types, will have diagonals that bisect each other. Now this is actually just asking about the angle. I read it wrong. But yeah, I can look right here. Diagonals bisect the opposite angles. Okay? So there you go. Select if the statement is always, sometimes, never true. The diagonals of a rectangle bisect each angle. Do we not just do that? No, that was a rhombus. No, okay, so on a rectangle, it's going to be sometimes true, because if the rectangle is also a square, if it's a type of rectangle that would be a square where it was a rhombus and a rectangle, then they would bisect each other. So it should be sometimes, okay? So just being a rectangle, that doesn't happen. But if the rectangle so happens to actually be a square, then yes. I have the answers here. Always, sometimes, or never. A parallelogram is equiangular. That sometimes it's not on here, and we'll talk about that another time. That's not important for what we're doing right now, so I don't want to confuse you with that. Select if the statement is always, sometimes, or never true. The diagonals of a square are perpendicular. So if I look on a square, okay, doesn't say that the diagonals are perpendicular, but if I look up here in rhombus, diagonals are perpendicular. So I got to make sure that I look everywhere. Okay, I have to look all the way up through here. If I'm talking about a square, I have to make sure that nothing in this box makes that true, or this box, or that box. Okay, you have to make sure and check them all. So a square is always a type of rhombus. They are perpendicular diagonals. The diagonals are perpendicular in a rhombus, so always true. Select if the statement is always, sometimes, or never true. The diagonals of a rhombus are perpendicular. Yeah, right here. Diagonals are perpendicular. It tells you right there. Those are the easier ones when it's right in that exact box in that shape that you need it to be. A parallelogram is a quadrilateral. Yeah, a parallelogram is always a quadrilateral. Quadrilateral is any polygon with 4 sides. Parallelogram has 4 sides, so it's always a parallelogram, or it's always a quadrilateral. Diagonals of a parallelogram sometimes bisect each other. Yeah, sometimes they bisect each other, because if the diagonals bisect each other, actually it's not a sometimes bisect, they always bisect, because parallelogram, you've got right here, diagonals bisect each other. So that throws you off because it says sometimes. It should be always bisect each other. So it's